them as good times. Those of us who are around to remember. The pleasures we enjoyed back then, we found in the simple things, in friendship, in family. We were young then, and innocent, and filled with wonder at the sight of our own creations. How naive and starry-eyed we must have been in those days, when splitting the atom was just one man's fantasy. We made do with our nickels and dimes. Better than that, we had the time of our lives. Ah, yes, those were the days. San Francisco in the 1930s. It was an Indian summer day in San Francisco in the fall of 1929. Fair and mild, and not a trace of fog. By 8 o'clock, the Pacific Stock Exchange had already been open for hours, and by then, the panic was full-blown. The exchange never closed that Black Thursday. Desperate brokers stayed all night, slaves to the ticker tape. By the weekend, thousands of investors had lost their life savings. Some of the Bay Area's most respected institutions had taken a real beating. Fireman's Fund, Emporium Capwell, Standard Oil of California, all down. In the following months and years, scores of Bay Area businesses would fail. Middle-class families who had prospered in the flapper years would find themselves lined up for surplus food and make-work jobs. Neighborhoods were studded with soup kitchens and bread lines. The most famous was run by a society matron who identified herself only as the White Angel. The more you had, the more you had to lose. Kids just out of college found themselves lined up for jobs behind experienced breadwinners, people who had lost what had taken them a lifetime to accumulate. But strange as it may seem, most of the people who are around today to remember those Depression years remember making the best of bad times, and in the process, having a very good time indeed.
Job, everything was sweet. It was sweet to go out, it was sweet to go to a hotel and go dancing, even though, and it was only a couple of dollars, you know. And everybody was interested in sort of an upbeat mood, sort of a happiness pervading the whole thing.
Those were the days when you could take a dip in Fleischhacker Pool, the world's largest, for just a nickel. Unfortunately, only a few chilly blocks from Ocean Beach. Or you could have your pick of hot, cold, fresh, or salt water at the world-famous Sutro Baths, just up the street from Playland at the beach. For a whole day's outing, you could go across the bay to the amusement park at Neptune's Beach in Alameda. But first, you'd spend the better part of the day getting there, on the ferry.
You know, you can imagine yourself, you know, going, taking a regular steamer ride, you know, to New York through the Panama Canal or something. You know, you could picture yourself in some mystery drama or something, you know, or standing out in the decks, you know, with the wind whipping against you, you know. If you were young enough, you know, you had a good imagination.
In those days, the ferries were so popular that on weekends, the line of cars waiting to cross the bay would stretch clear across town to Van Ness Avenue. In those days, whether you went by ferry or by cable car, getting there was half the fun.
couldn't wait to get on the California Street Dinky. They don't call them the Dinkies anymore, do they? Well, the cable cars were always the Dinkies on account of the bell. Ding, 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 ding. And that was the Dinky.
If a day in the sun was what you were after, you could take the trolley into the Mission to watch the Seals play ball at the old Recreation Park. Even at the back of the bleachers, you could catch yourself a foul ball.
And it was a colorful ballpark because you were right on top of the field. You know, you weren't a mile away from the action. And when a ball player went to bat, you know, you could give them encouragement, curse them, spit at them, or do anything they want, and they did. You know, they talked to him, you bum, let's see you get a hit this time, you know, and it was kind of personal. You know, you were right on top of the field.
That personal feeling was something you'd find all over town back in the 30s, because San Francisco was the kind of small-town city where everyone knew everyone. At a time when big-time pro ball was decades away, the big names in town belonged to high school football heroes. Guys like Alan Beals, Al Santucci, Eddie Forrest, and Milt Vucinich.
What were all your nicknames?
Well, they called me Snooch, short for Santucci.
I was called Vooch. Well, the newspapers used to call him the Slashing Slav. It was his nickname in the newspapers.
I suppose.
And I was the Sea Pig. Who was you?
I don't know.
He was called Nichols. Nichols Beals.
Dick Tracy came out with the Heels Beals one time, and that was stuck for a little while, but not long.
It was for these guys, high school ball players, that the city's first big stadium was built, Kezar Stadium. And the fun didn't stop at nightfall. Just 20 cents bought you a ticket to the best movie theaters, which meant not only a double bill, but a newsreel, a cartoon, and live music from the house orchestra. For another 75 cents, you could top off the evening with a 7-course Italian feast in North Beach. But if you were young and in love, there was only one spot to be on a Friday or a Saturday night, at a place called the Rose Bowl. Every weekend, thousands descended on the tiny town of Larkspur in Marin to dance under the stars at the Rose Bowl, an outdoor dance hall sponsored by the Larkspur Volunteer Fire Department.
She whispered, "Be true to me." She sighed, she's too high for me.
John and Evelyn Craig are still dancing together, 50 years after their first date at the Rose Bowl.
The most impressive part of the evening for me was the waterfalls. I used to play the storm.
Well, actually...
It wasn't a waterfall.
It wasn't a firefall either. I heard some... But to me, if I remember correctly, it was representing a thunderstorm with lightning and all
lightning
the fireworks
and lights
and whatnot.
And they did play the storm.
Well, After the Storm was the name of a song at that time, and they would play that.
I loved that part.
You're young. You can find amusement most anything. If you can't spend a lot of money, why, you can find a way to spend a dime and still have a good time.
We did.
And I think that was the general thing with all the younger people, was that they made the best of what you had.
When we return to San Francisco in the 30s, in the depths of the Depression, San Francisco continues to be a wide-open town where good times can still be found.
Despite its heavenly appearance, the San Francisco of the 1930s was anything but angelic. From our forefathers, the gold miners and the merchant marines of the Barbary Coast, we'd inherited some fine old traditions. Among them, a reputation for being a wide-open town. These were Prohibition years, remember, but even that couldn't stem the flow of good cheer.
Everybody bootlegged. Nobody would turn anybody in. Bootlegging was not a crime to the ordinary people. A probation agent would come, and they'd have to have a man stand guard over their car while they were raiding. They'd come out, the car wouldn't run. All the bystanders would go and break all the spark plugs or let the air out of the tire. Yeah.
The city's high spirits made for some pretty tall tales. And some great copy. Nobody knew that better than a Sacramento-born writer who came here in 1936, seeking his fortune amidst the city's folly.
It was possible to stay up 24 hours a day and never go without a drink. It was a wide-open town. The Tenderloin was wide open. Anything you wanted was available.
Wet or dry, prohibition or not, the San Francisco of the 1930s was an all-night town. Nightclubs like the Forbidden City and the Bal Tabarin had floor shows at 4 in the morning.
Then there was the Music Box over on O'Farrell Street, which is now the Great American Music Hall. And there disported herself the famous Sally Rand with her fans and her showgirls and her after-hours club upstairs called the Blue Room.
For better or for worse, speakeasies and nightclubs weren't the only establishments where patron vices public.
Sally Stanford, a famous madam, she had a huge house on Russian Hill, and her girls were all very, like socialites. They were like junior leaguers. They wore dusters, and they wore feather boas, and they wore corsages, and they acted like ladies. And it was even on the Gray Line tour for a while. You could drop in if you were on the tour and meet Sally's girls.
All kinds of shady enterprises flourished in San Francisco in those days. Much of it was said, under the paid protection of the city's boys in blue. Somehow that didn't seem out of keeping with our unruly past. It was just business as usual. Pat Brown, who would later become the city's district attorney and eventually governor of California, has a unique perspective on the city's underbelly. His father ran an illegal gambling parlor, and his father-in-law was once a captain in the police department.
Someone said to me one day, he said, the San Francisco Police Department is honeycombed with graft. And the other lawyer that was standing right next to me said, let me tell you something, the San Francisco Police Department is honeycombed with honesty. And I never forgot that.
Even in the depths of the Depression, the city's nightlife prospered, attracting partygoers from all over.
The city was full of people from Hollywood every weekend. They came up on a train aptly called the Lark. And they'd come up on Friday night, and I'd see them all over town. All these famous people would be out nightclubbing because Los Angeles really had no nightclubs and very few restaurants. So they all loved San Francisco.
While most of the city loved them in return, there were some places where even the brightest stars weren't entirely welcome. And one of those places was a ritual-laden affair called Monday Lunch at the St. Francis.
They frowned very much on theatrical people. The maitre d' there was not at all happy with them. And he would put, I remember it was Rita Hayworth, I think, that he would put near the kitchen someplace. There was a real snob deal.
The regulars at the Monday Lunch were the daughters and sons of the city's founders. The newspaper society columns took up pages and pages, filled with their doings.
Teas were popular. you always wrote who presided at the tea table. I mean, you never hear that nowadays. And there would be Mrs. So-and-so at the coffee urn and Mrs. somebody else at the teapot.
Look in any direction, and you could see the efforts of the Golden Circle to turn our little pioneer town into a capital of culture. There was the Opera House, completed in the worst years of the Depression. The major dailies, 4 of them. Stores filled with the latest fashions from abroad. And yet, again and again, you saw the same names: DeYoung, Spreckles, Stanford, Magnan, Crocker.
They were very insolent. As a matter of fact, when they'd give a dinner party, you could practically make up the guest list. If they say they were going to have 25 or 30, you'd say, and the so-and-sos and so-and-sos. I always wondered why they never got awfully sick of each other.
While their husbands made and lost fortunes, the society women competed fiercely on a battlefield of florists, caterers, butlers, and maids. And no one could mount a campaign like the mistress of Filoli Gardens, Lurleen Roth.
Now, she used to transport that whole estate into a fairyland. I mean, she would bring up 3 shiploads. I'm talking about ocean liner loads of orchids, and there'd be 8 million orchids all over the place. And it was just unbelievable. They would plan a party and plan 6 months on it. And then each lady, each grande dame there in Burlingame society would have a party for their granddaughter or the daughter, and they would fall on consecutive nights during the winter season. And each lady wanted her party to be better than the others, you know, naturally. So it was a tremendous effort to keep that kind of enthusiasm up on our part. I mean, I just had to do better each successive night, you know, to get through the thing. And then I was flat out for 2 weeks. I couldn't move. I just lay in bed all day. It was a group, I would say 500-600 of the, what we used to say, the best people. And they were really nice. They were the best people. And they still are, as far as I'm concerned.
When we return to San Francisco in the 30s, union activism and labor unrest lead to the violent waterfront strike of 1934.
Today, it may look like a tourist trap. In the 30s, it was the city's lifeblood.
The smells in the city were just unbelievable in those Depression days, and right up to the war, because the big Folgers and MJB and Hills Brothers, all the big coffee companies were doing their roasting right down there on the waterfront. And any small boy or girl would come to San Francisco, you smell this aroma of coffee, and it was just a wonderful, exciting city.
After school dances, we'd go to the Embarcadero and get fresh fruit right off the boats. And they would, we'd talk to the greengrocers there and the fruit grocers and all that, and they were spilling them all out, and they talked in different languages, and some were Oriental, some were Italian. What a city to grow up in.
You go along the waterfront in a boat, and you see the sterns of these big Trans-Pacific and intercoastal freighters there, and they came from all over the world, from Oslo and from London and Calcutta and Hong Kong and Singapore. And it was a city of dreams, no question about it.
By 1933, those dreams had turned into nightmares for the men who worked the waterfront. In 1919, the waterfront unions had been devastated by an unsuccessful strike, and by the end of World War I, they were virtually powerless. The violent and politically charged 19-teens, a decade of union activism across the country, had become the complacent 20s. With jobs in abundance, it didn't seem to matter so much that the only way you could get a job on the San Francisco waterfront was to join the company-run association that called itself a union, but did little to address workers' needs. All that would change in the 30s. The names would be different, but all over the country, the story would be the same. As the Depression deepened and the volume of cargo dwindled, More and more unemployed laborers showed up at the docks looking for work. With so many men competing for so few jobs, corruption spread like wildfire. Seaman Bill Bailey remembers the indignity of it all.
Now, the ship and crimp's job, he was employed by the ship owner. And the ship owner told him, they said, we don't want no union men on the ship. We don't want anybody who talks politics. We don't want nobody who's going to cause us any trouble. And your job is to see that my ships are supplied with such men. In other words, robots or idiots, that type of thing. So the ship and crimp had a little something going on the side. He figured, well, as long as he was lord and master of putting men on the ship, he could make them bow a little bit. I remember one of these characters telling me when I said, hey, how about a job, fella? He said, look, Bailey, I never see you in my restaurant eating. You don't sleep in my boarding house. I never see you in my store when it comes to buying clothes. You know? He said, I don't even see you chasing around with any of my whores. Now, you want me to give you a job over all these other guys? Okay. Well, I mean, that's how degrading things were.
In 1933, Roosevelt's National Recovery Act guaranteed workers the right to form their own unions, regardless of opposition from employers. A San Francisco chapter of the International Longshoremen's Association was hastily assembled, and practically overnight, the fledgling union found itself in a deadlock with the shipping companies.
No matter what we suggested, no. It was no all the time. Well, we finally realized that there was only one thing left to do, and that is to call a strike.
Small at first, the strike gradually gained momentum as more and more longshoremen joined the union and took their places in the picket lines. Then, 2 months into the strike, after the shipping companies attempted to open the port with scab labor, the violence began. All told, 2 were killed, more than 100 injured. Several of the victims were innocent bystanders. It was to be a major turning point for the strikers.
It showed the employers that the people of San Francisco, not just the longshoremen, and not just the union people either, but that the average person in San Francisco was fed up with the cold-blooded murder of innocent people.
In the days following that bloody Thursday, one voice was heard above all the rest. It belonged to a young Australian seaman named Harry Bridges. Softly persuasive, he seemed an unlikely candidate for the role of a labor strongman.
I don't think he had 2 pairs of shoes. He wore the same pair of pants for months. Slept on the floor half of the time. Now, that wasn't the labor leaders that's supposed to, who ended up in the Mark Hopkins Hotel or 5 or 6 suits of clothes and all that type of stuff. He didn't have nothing.
On July 12, 1934, the mighty Teamsters walked out in support of the striking longshoremen. Other local unions followed closely on their heels. The city was shutting down. The general strike had begun.
On the 3rd day of the general strike, I was walking down from 28th Street and Church all the way to the waterfront, to Pier 37. Not a streetcar was running, not a taxi cab was available. Everything was quiet, and I felt like I was walking on air because everything was closed down.
When the strikers went back to work a week later, all but one of the longshoremen's demands had been met. It was one of the biggest victories in labor history, but it came at a high price. The closure of the port during the strike would end up costing the shipping companies more than $500 million. It would take years and many more strikes to close the gap for others on the waterfront. And on a personal level, Harry Bridges and others among the labor leadership would be haunted 2 decades later by their own words and actions in that strike during the communist witch hunts of the 1950s.
Somebody has to make a sacrifice somewhere along the line that we can advance these things. Now, if we didn't take a chance to go out on a picket line and getting our head bashed in or getting worked over by goons or vigilantes or whatever, I mean, we'd just be all chattel slaves or something. We might as well go with our hat in the hand or we'd be still doing it. It's a shame that we can't live in an ideal world, but that's the way it is. And somebody has to take a beating to try to advance our cause.
When we return to San Francisco in the 30s, San Franciscans try a new road to recovery, and the technological wonder of radio becomes a national addiction.
It was the first national addiction. To some, it was a technological wonder. To others, an insidious force. But for most of us, it was just plain wonderful.
Hail, Silver, away!
Oh, Mr. McCarthy.
Gangbusters.
By the mid-1930s, practically every Bay Area home had a radio. In the depths of the Depression, you could turn your dial and bring anyone from Fibber McGee on up to the president, right into your living room.
What you doing, Andy?
Hello there, Amos. Just checking my bank account here. 6 million, 8 million.
One program, Amos and Andy, was so popular that movie theaters piped it into their lobbies so that ticket buyers wouldn't have to stay home to listen. Many of radio's earliest hits originated here at 111 Sutter, at the West Coast headquarters of NBC. Hundreds of musicians and actors and actresses gave live performances here. In the days before tape recordings, they'd have to repeat their performances 3 times, once for each time zone. Writers and producers were constantly searching for new ideas, new concepts, pioneers in a brave new medium. Edna Fisher, a pianist on one of the most popular local programs, the Blue Monday Jamboree, remembers the scramble to fill the airtime.
I'd get an idea, I could go right down there and go on the air with it, you know. We never had rehearsals. They'd say to me 5 minutes before we went on, "What are you going to play tonight?" And I'd say, "Well, I don't know. I've had a lot of requests to do what I did last Monday night. I think I'll do the 12th Street Rag again."
In 1930, writer Carlton Morse came up with an idea for a show about a family. Just a typical San Francisco family. Just one man's family.
Well, it was so different than anything they'd ever had. It was on a lower level. It was not bang, bang, bang. It was mama talking to the children or her father. And they said, "Boy, you're written out. You better quit and we'll call you if we need anything like this." Well, the show went on that April and never went off the air again for 27 years.
One Man's Family is dedicated to the mothers and fathers of the younger generation and to their bewildering offspring. Today we present Chapter 7, Book 69, entitled Triplets and Redheads.
One Man's Family was the first soap opera, and it quickly became one of radio's biggest success stories. Night after night, week after week, listeners got to know Mother and Father Barber and their offspring. It was hard to believe the family really didn't exist, except in Carlton Morse's imagination. The studio even released a family album and a book of Mother Barber's favorite recipes and a diary. For almost 3 decades, Bernice Berwin played the role of Hazel, the Barber's eldest daughter.
Carlton followed us quite a good deal. For instance, Betty, who had so many children, Well, Jean Rouverol was forever having a child. And that's how Betty and Jack had so many children.
I'd rather be the very meekest of housewives with a man to hold me in his arms in the dark hours of the night than be the smartest, most glamorous, most independent female in the world.
Maybe you're the wifely type.
All women are the wifely type. That's the one thing I keep praying for with our 6 daughters. Happy marriage for each. I'm doing my doggonedest to mold them into girls who will be lovable and desirable.
You really believe in marriage, don't you?
You bet I do. And it's just cheap, smart talk to say anything else. In the hungriest years of the Depression, the Barber family chronicles gave fans what they craved most, a taste of the good life. San Francisco tour guides proudly pointed out one of the grander homes in the city's affluent Seacliff district, identifying it as the home of America's favorite family. The Barber home really only existed in the dreams of Carlton Morse and of his listeners.
Families throughout the United States identified with us, and they wished that they had a family like that.
As the years passed, times seemed only to get worse and worse. Drought had turned much of the Midwest into a dust bowl, and many of the desperate loaded up their belongings and moved west to what they hoped would be the golden land of opportunity. Instead, they found the resentment and prejudice that would be the subject of John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath. 5 years after the stock market crash, almost a quarter of the Bay Area's workforce was still out on the streets. Many of the unemployed went to work for the alphabet soup of federal works projects. The work was everything from clerical to custodial to just plain hard labor. The workers came from every conceivable walk of life. They had only one thing in common. There was no other way to survive. As a teenager, Joe Bright was one of thousands of young Californians who joined the Civilian Conservation Corps. His starting pay was $30 a month. $25 of that was automatically sent to his family in San Francisco.
My mother and father used that money to pay the rent of the house we were living in. And it was like money falling from heaven.
Young men like Joe Bright would help plant more than 2 billion trees. They would build San Francisco's aquatic park and Berkeley's Rose Garden. Federal funds would also help build the Bay Bridge, the Caldecott Tunnel, and dams and roads by the score. But the federal projects didn't always inspire gratitude or public acceptance. One of the smallest programs, employing only 26 people, ate up more column inches than all the rest combined. The project was painting murals in the recently completed monument to fireman Adolph Coit. It was a lifesaver for many local artists. But according to the popular press, the murals were more than pretty paintings. They were communist propaganda. Critics cited the depiction of leftist reading materials in several scenes as proof of their allegations, and the official opening of the tower was delayed for months as the squabbling went on and on. At the same time, another project was gearing up that would change the face of the entire Bay Area. Lacking federal funding and public support, it was a project some said was impossible. But Chicago engineer Joseph Strauss wanted to build a bridge to top all others. It took more than a decade of public debate and bond issues and court hearings and committee meetings. But Strauss finally got his big chance. Ironically, after years of arguing and pleading, It was the Depression that finally made the building of the bridge possible. In fact, made it a public duty because it provided jobs. Joseph Strauss quickly became one of the Bay Area's biggest employers. Jobs on the bridge paid as much as $11 an hour. And at that price, men were lined up daily, ready and willing to risk their lives. Altogether, 11 men would lose their lives working on the bridge, and many more would come mighty close. The survivors called themselves the Halfway to Hell Club. Of course, the Golden Gate Bridge wasn't the only game in town. At the same time Strauss was making his dream a reality, the other bridge was also under construction. Started in 1934 and completed 2 years later, the Bay Bridge was actually 3 times as long as the Golden Gate and twice as expensive. The Bay Bridge was something at which to wonder, all right. There's no denying that. But there was just something special about the Golden Gate that captured all our hearts. It was more than a way to get somewhere. It was a testament to the courage and the sheer audacity of the men who dreamt of and built the world's most beautiful bridge.
When we return to San Francisco in the 30s, the city throws the event of the decade, the Golden Gate International Exposition.
The year was 1939, and it seemed the worst was behind us. People were going back to work. The bridges were open, and commuters were pouring into the city from newfound suburbs all over the Bay. To celebrate the return of good times, we threw the event of the decade. With the bridges built and the future looking bright, it was time for the city that knew how to strut its stuff. Its official name was the Golden Gate International Exposition, but to us, it was simply Treasure Island. Everyone had a day at the fair, from twins to ski jumpers to foreigners of all lands. Oh, and who could forget these lovelies?
Well, the favorite thing there was those fat women riding those burros. That one woman come in there and looked like the burro had saddlebags. Her rear end stood on both sides of the thing, you know. And she'd trot him and she'd, you know, she was nude, you know, and flop all. I thought that was the best thing in the whole show.
But the grandest exhibit of all wasn't even officially part of the fair. It took place only once a day, and only the extremely lucky or wealthy got a chance to take a ride on the newly inaugurated China Clipper.
Honest to goodness, as far as I was concerned, it was like these space shuttles now. It was just so far out. It was exciting, but it was adventuresome.
The China Clipper cut the trip to the Orient down from 21 days on a ship to 60 hours of flying time. As adventures go, the China Clipper was on the formal side. You could while away those hours aloft quite comfortably, playing cards, eating freshly prepared meals, or sleeping in your own personal and private sleeping compartment. The fair was such a success that it opened for a second season in 1940. But for many of us, the new decade opened with uncertainty about the future. Hitler's troops were rolling into Poland, and the Japanese had invaded the Chinese mainland.
I hope the United States will keep out of this war. I believe that it will, as long as it remains within my power to prevent.
Yet the question on all our minds was, how long would it be before we were at war too? At the same time, unknown to most of us, a decade of hard work was finally paying off for the scientists in this rickety wooden building on the Berkeley campus. The men here had jerry-rigged their way into a brand new science, the science of splitting atoms. Scarcely 6 inches across, this tiny device, the very first atom smasher, ushered in the nuclear age. This tiny device and its inventor, Ernest O. Lawrence, would change the course of history. But in 1939, Lawrence was just another hometown egghead who happened to have won the Nobel Prize. It would be 6 years before most of us would understand the real impact of his invention, with the bombing of Hiroshima. To many of us, the 30s were untroubled times, when the streets were safe and our consciences were clear, when we were free to enjoy the simpler pleasures that were abundant in our city by the bay. It was a time when many of us shared an almost childlike innocence.
Innocence was the keynote of the city. We were all naive. We were all wide-eyed. We were all crazy about San Francisco. We were madly in love. It was like being in love with a person. It was a city of sort of a feminine persona about it.
When I was growing up, I did not know then, at 9 years old, what sex feelings were. So I fell passionately in love with San Francisco, thinking that it was a thing to fall in love with.
Thought of you, and I forget to do the little ordinary things that everyone ought to do.
We loved the town. Wouldn't think of going anywhere else.
It's just the thought of you, the very thought of you, my love.
What?